The air that night carried a chill sharper than winter itself, cutting through the quiet suburban streets like a whisper that something terrible had already happened. The houses stood in neat rows, white fences, trimmed lawns, windows glowing faintly with the warmth of ordinary life. But down on Ridgewood Lane, one house was different. Its lights flickered behind drawn curtains, and from the open back door drifted the faint metallic scent of something wrong. It was the kind of smell that once noticed, never left you. Inside, the stillness was broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the slow dripping of a faucet that hadn't been turned off all the way. The kitchen floor was smeared with dark streaks that glistened under the dim light, trailing toward the hallway like the path of something dragged or carried. A mug lay shattered near the counter, its pieces scattered across the tile in a strange, deliberate pattern, as if someone had tried to clean but stopped halfway. Realizing it was useless, when Officer Melanie Griggs arrived, she paused on the threshold, her flashlight beam slicing through the dark. She had answered hundreds of calls in her career, but something about this one felt off from the moment dispatch spoke the address. A disturbance call from a quiet, upper-middle-class neighborhood was usually nothing. Domestic arguments, loud music, the occasional runaway. But this time the caller hadn't said a word. Only silence on the other end, followed by a faint, muffled sound before the line went dead. She stepped carefully into the house, radio crackling softly at her side. Unit 47 entering residence. Possible disturbance, she said, her voice steady, though her fingers tightened slightly on the flashlight. The beam caught the glint of something metallic near the base of the stairs, keys scattered like someone had dropped them mid-motion. The faint smell of blood grew stronger. When she turned the corner into the living room, her light found him. David Campbell, 41 years old, high school English teacher, married, father of 2. The kind of man who stayed late after school to help students with essays and coached debate team for no extra pay. He lay motionless on the carpet, one arm twisted unnaturally beneath him, his face turned toward the wall. The blood had already pooled beneath his head, seeping into the fibers. There was no struggle visible, no overturned furniture, no sign of forced entry. Just the quiet aftermath of something precise and deliberate. Griggs knelt, checked for a pulse she already knew wasn't there, then slowly stood and drew her weapon. Her instincts screamed that whoever had done this hadn't gone far. The house was too still, too calculated. She moved toward the stairs. Halfway up, she heard it, the faint creak of floorboards, a sound like someone shifting their weight in the dark. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. "Police!" she called out. "If someone's up there, come out now." Silence. Then a voice, quiet but laced with something unnervingly calm. "You're too late." The words came from the top of the stairs. Her flashlight snapped upward, cutting through the shadows, and there he was, Ethan Walker, 17 years old, pale, motionless, standing barefoot at the top step in a plain black hoodie. His eyes were empty, his posture too relaxed for what had just happened downstairs. He looked down at her the way a child might look at an insect, curious, detached, almost bored. "Don't move," Griggs ordered, gun raised, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Put your hands where I can see them." Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if testing her reaction. Then, without a word, he sat down on the top step, resting his elbows on his knees. "He shouldn't have talked to me like that," he said softly. "He shouldn't have said those things." Griggs kept her weapon steady. "Who are you talking about?" Ethan's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Mr. Campbell. He thought he could embarrass me. Thought he could make me feel small in front of everyone." He looked toward the hallway, where the faint light from the kitchen glowed like an ember. "He found out what happens when you make me feel small." For a moment, Griggs couldn't move. The calmness in his voice didn't fit with the scene downstairs. No panic, no remorse. Just an eerie certainty, as if this had all been inevitable. She radioed for backup, keeping her voice level, but her mind raced. A teacher dead, a student standing over him, and a confession spoken like poetry. Within minutes, the quiet street filled with the blue and red glow of police cruisers. Neighbors gathered behind yellow tape, whispering names and speculations. Inside, Ethan Walker sat on the floor of his bedroom, wrists cuffed, staring at the wall. When detectives asked if he wanted to call his parents, he said nothing. When they read him his rights, he nodded once, almost absently, as if the words were part of a script he'd already rehearsed. At the station, under the harsh fluorescent lights, Detective Raymond Holt leaned across the table and studied the boy before him. 17, slender build, intelligent eyes that betrayed calculation. No visible injuries, no signs of struggle, just quiet arrogance. "Ethan," Holt said, his voice calm but firm, "do you know why you're here?" Ethan looked up slowly, his eyes reflecting the sterile light. "Because everyone overreacts when someone finally tells the truth." "The truth?" Holt repeated. "You're saying what you did was the truth?" Ethan shrugged. "People lie all the time. They pretend to care, pretend to be decent. Mr. Campbell wasn't who everyone thought he was. He said things, pushed me, wanted to make me look weak." Holt studied him for a long moment. "And you decided to kill him for that?" For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Ethan's face. Not guilt, not fear, but amusement. "I decided to show him what weakness really looks like." Later, when the footage of that interrogation was played in court, it would silence the entire room. The flatness in his tone, the slight upward curl of his mouth, the absence of any shred of empathy. It was the moment everyone realized this case wasn't just about a murder. It was about a mind that had long since stepped outside the boundaries of human emotion. By morning, the story had exploded across every screen in Ohio. 17-year-old student arrested for murder of beloved teacher. The headlines poured out like wildfire, each one feeding the frenzy. The photos of Ethan, his yearbook portrait, his honor roll certificate, the smiling image of a boy who looked harmless, only made it worse. People couldn't reconcile the face with the crime. They didn't want to believe that evil could look so ordinary. At his first court appearance, reporters filled every bench. Cameras flashed as the deputies brought him in, shackled at the wrists and ankles, his expression unchanged. He walked like someone who had accepted nothing and feared nothing. When the judge asked if he understood the charges against him, he nodded once. "Murder in the first degree," he said flatly, as if reciting from memory. His attorney, Michael Clark, a seasoned defense lawyer with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for impossible cases, placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Don't speak unless I tell you to," he murmured, but Ethan didn't seem to hear. He was scanning the crowd instead, eyes moving slowly from one spectator to another, as if searching for someone or something that could still amuse him. In the third row sat his mother, Elizabeth Walker. Her face was pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had refused to speak to reporters, refused to make any statement, but the look in her eyes said everything. Shock, grief, and something deeper, something like recognition. She knew this boy. Not the headlines, not the monster they described, but the boy she had raised, the one who had smiled at her across the breakfast table and told her he loved her before heading to school. She wanted to believe it wasn't him, that this was a mistake, that something had gone terribly wrong. But deep down, she knew. When the prosecution began laying out their case, it was meticulous, methodical, and devastating. Olivia Rodriguez, the district attorney, stood before the jury and spoke with quiet intensity. This was not an act of passion. This was not a moment of madness. This was premeditated, cold, calculated. He waited until Mr. Campbell was alone, followed him, confronted him, and executed him with precision. Then he stood over his body and watched him die. She played the recording of Ethan's confession, and the courtroom fell into absolute silence. His voice filled the speakers, steady, calm, detached. There was no anger in it, no shouting, no confusion, just a chilling clarity that turned the air cold. When the defense responded, Clark tried to humanize him. "Ethan Walker is not a monster," he said. "He is a child, a deeply troubled young man failed by those around him." What happened that night was not a reflection of evil, but of despair. A breakdown, not a blueprint. But as the trial unfolded, that narrative began to unravel. Witnesses spoke of Ethan's behavior at school, his outbursts, his fascination with violent literature, his obsession with control. One student testified that he once said, "You can make people disappear if you just don't care enough." Another recalled a chilling remark during an argument. "Some people need to be reminded they're not as important as they think." The more they revealed, the more it became clear that this wasn't a single moment of rage. It was the end result of something that had been growing for years. And yet, through it all, Ethan remained unshaken. He watched the proceedings with the detached amusement of someone attending his own documentary. When the prosecution showed photos of the crime scene, he barely blinked. When witnesses wept on the stand, he tilted his head, curious, as if studying an unfamiliar emotion. Even when his mother broke down in tears, whispering his name under her breath, he didn't look at her. The moment that changed everything came midway through the trial, when the judge, Harris, a man known for his patience, asked Ethan if he understood the gravity of his situation. Ethan looked him in the eye and smiled. "You think you scare me because you wear a robe and sit higher up," he said quietly. "But you're just another old man pretending to be in control." Gasps filled the courtroom. Judge Harris froze, his face turning pale with disbelief. Clark leaned over, whispering frantically for Ethan to stop talking, but the boy didn't. "You all sit there pretending you know what justice means," Ethan continued, his tone casual, almost conversational. "You have no idea what power feels like until you take it from someone who thought they had it." The gavel slammed down, the judge's voice thundered for order, but the damage was done. In that instant, the mask of innocence shattered completely, revealing the cold, unrepentant core beneath. And somewhere in the back of the courtroom, Elizabeth Walker closed her eyes, her hands trembling. For the first time, she saw her son not as the boy she raised, but as the thing he had become. The trial would only grow darker from there. The days that followed that courtroom outburst became a blur of chaos and disbelief. News networks ran the clip on loop, the smirk, the mocking tone, the way he leaned back like he was untouchable. "You think you scare me." Those 5 words would haunt everyone who heard them. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Calm, cold, as if the entire legal system was a stage, and he was the only one who understood it was all just a performance. Even the jurors couldn't look at him the same way after that day. The boyish image his defense had tried to maintain was gone. What remained was something hollow, the calculated detachment of someone who had already decided that remorse was beneath him. Outside, the world was watching. Protesters gathered in front of the courthouse, some holding signs demanding life in prison, others shouting that he needed help, not punishment. Inside, the tension thickened with every passing hour. Detectives came forward with new evidence: the deleted messages, the online journals, the chilling search history that painted a portrait of premeditation. One entry, dated just a week before the murder, read, "There's power in silence." People always talk about empathy and guilt, but that's just noise. When you finally stop caring, the world becomes quiet, clean. When that journal was read aloud in court, the audience sat frozen. Elizabeth Walker covered her mouth, a broken sound escaping her throat. That voice, that phrasing, she had read things like that before, in the dark corners of her son's notebooks. But she had told herself it was just teenage angst. Just words, not a prophecy. The prosecution's case built itself like a tower of stone, each piece heavier than the last. Surveillance footage showed Ethan leaving school that afternoon, his backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder. He walked past the main gate, turned down Maple Avenue, and vanished from view for 38 minutes. The next time he appeared, it was on a neighbor's security camera, walking calmly down Ridgewood Lane, his hands clean, his face emotionless. Olivia Rodriguez presented it all with surgical precision. He wasn't angry, she said, pacing slowly before the jury. He wasn't panicked. He was at peace. That's not what loss of control looks like. That's what satisfaction looks like. In the defense's corner, Michael Clark felt the weight pressing down. He'd handled hardened criminals before. Men who had shot, stabbed, or beaten their victims in fits of rage. But Ethan was different. He didn't fit any mold. No trauma to point to, no history of abuse or neglect. A stable home, loving parents, good grades. Clark had spent sleepless nights searching for something, anything, that could explain it. But there was nothing. Only the void. When it was his turn to put Ethan on the stand, Clark hesitated longer than he ever had in his career. Every instinct screamed not to, but the jury needed to see the boy, not the monster. Maybe if Ethan spoke in his own words, they would see humanity flicker through the cracks. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and turned to his client. "Ethan," he said softly, "the jury needs to understand you. Just answer what I ask, nothing more. Do you understand?" Ethan nodded once, his expression unreadable. As he took the stand, every camera in the room focused in, the click of shutters echoing like gunfire. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat down, looking perfectly composed. Too composed. Clark started gently. "Ethan, can you tell us, in your own words, what your relationship was like with Mr. Campbell?" "He was my teacher," Ethan said simply. "Did you like him?" "I respected him," he replied. Then after a pause, "Until he stopped respecting me." Clark took a slow breath. "What do you mean by that?" "He humiliated me," Ethan said, still calm. "He thought because he was older, smarter, more experienced, that he could say whatever he wanted. But he didn't know what I was capable of." Whispers rippled through the gallery. Clark froze for half a second, praying the jury didn't hear what they thought they heard. "Ethan, did you intend to hurt him that night?" Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling as if searching for an answer he already knew. "Intent is just another word for decision," he said softly, "and I made mine long before that night." Clark's blood ran cold. He could feel the entire case unraveling right there, in front of everyone. The prosecutor didn't even need to object. She just watched, waiting, letting him destroy himself with every word. Olivia stood, her voice steady. "Mr. Walker," she said, walking closer to the witness stand, "you talk about respect, about power. Tell me, when you watched your teacher die, did you feel powerful?" For the first time, Ethan's lips curved into that same haunting smile. "No," he said, "I felt free." The gasp that followed was like an explosion. The judge's gavel slammed down again and again, but the noise wouldn't stop. The reporters whispering, the jurors staring, the sound of a mother quietly breaking in the back row. Elizabeth Walker's face had gone white. She gripped the bench in front of her, her body shaking. Every maternal instinct she had left screamed at her to do something, to speak, to stop this spiral. But the words caught in her throat. She had raised him, loved him, defended him, and now he was standing there confessing not just to the act, but to the thrill of it. When court adjourned for the day, Clark sat motionless, his hands pressed against his face. He'd lost control of his client, lost the jury, lost the illusion of redemption. The press swarmed the steps outside, shouting questions about the smirking teen killer, about whether he'd shown any remorse. But Ethan, led out in handcuffs, only looked at the flashing lights and smiled as if they were for him. That night, Elizabeth went home and sat in her son's empty room for hours. The walls were still covered in the things he loved, books, sketches, trophies, little pieces of normalcy that now felt like lies. On the desk, she found one of his old notebooks. Inside, on a torn page, were the words, "Everyone plays a role until they realized the script was never theirs to begin with." She closed it slowly, her tears falling onto the ink, blurring the lines. Somewhere deep down, she knew what she had to do. The next morning, when the courtroom doors opened, she wasn't in her usual seat in the back. Instead, she was standing near the prosecution's table. Her face was pale, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady. "Your Honor," she said, "I'd like to make a statement." Every eye turned toward her. Ethan looked up, confused for the first time since the trial began. "Mom?" he muttered. Judge Harris hesitated. "Mrs. Walker, this is highly irregular." "I understand," she interrupted, "but I can't stay silent anymore." The room fell into a hush so complete that even the sound of distant traffic seemed to fade away. Elizabeth turned toward the jury, then to her son. "Ethan, I've spent every day since your arrest asking myself what I did wrong, what I missed. I kept thinking maybe it was something I said or didn't say. But now I realize it wasn't about me or your father or Mr. Campbell. It was about you." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand." "I understand more than you think," she said softly. "You always wanted control. Even as a little boy, you hated when someone told you no. You'd go quiet, not angry, not sad, just empty. And I thought it was just your way of coping. But it wasn't. It was who you were becoming." The courtroom was dead silent. Even the judge didn't interrupt. Elizabeth took a breath, her voice trembling but unbroken. "You keep saying no one can control you, that power means never feeling anything. But I see now that's not power, that's emptiness. And I won't protect it anymore. I won't pretend my son is the victim here." Ethan's composure cracked for the first time. His jaw tightened, his voice rising, sharp and venomous. "You're doing this for them," he snapped, nodding toward the jury. "For the cameras? You think this changes anything?" "No," she whispered. "I'm doing it because someone has to stop you from thinking you've already won." Her words hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Ethan glared at her, his calm mask completely gone, his expression twisting into something feral. He tried to speak, but the deputies moved closer, ready to restrain him. Judge Harris's gavel struck once. "That's enough," he said, his voice firm. "Remove the defendant from the courtroom." Ethan shouted something then, words that were drowned out by the noise of movement, the scrape of chairs, the rustle of the crowd. For a moment, his mother turned away, unable to look as they led him out. But just before the door closed behind him, he turned his head and locked eyes with her one last time. There was no anger there anymore. Only the faintest, almost imperceptible trace of confusion. As if, for the first time, he didn't understand how he'd lost control. Outside, the sky had turned grey. Rain began to fall, soft and relentless, tapping against the courthouse steps as the crowd dispersed. Reporters shouted questions, cameras clicked, but Elizabeth didn't hear them. She walked down the steps, alone, each one heavier than the last, the weight of truth pressing down on her shoulders. Inside, Judge Harris sat in silence long after the courtroom had emptied. He had seen every kind of criminal pass through his court, but this case left something in him that wouldn't fade. Not the horror of the act, but the quiet certainty with which it was carried out. When the verdict finally came, it was unanimous, guilty on all counts, life without parole. Ethan showed no reaction as the words were read, no plea, no apology, just the same detached expression he'd worn since the beginning, though for the briefest moment. As his mother's quiet sob echoed through the room, something flickered behind his eyes. Not regret, not sorrow, but maybe, just maybe, the realization that he wasn't untouchable after all, and as they led him away, shackles clinking softly in rhythm with his footsteps, the smirk was gone. For the first time, he looked like what he truly was, a boy who thought he could command the world, only to be brought down by the one person who had loved him most, the mother who finally stood up. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the kind of silence that comes only after everything has been said, and nothing can ever be the same again. The echo of the gavel still hung in the courtroom when the deputies led Ethan Walker away. The heavy door closed behind him, sealing off the noise, the judgment, the mother's breaking sob that trailed him like a ghost. Down the corridor the world changed color. Pale walls, fluorescent lights, the hollow click of boots on tile. Each step carried him farther from the stage he had once owned and deeper into the system he had mocked. In the holding cell beneath the courthouse, silence wrapped itself around him. The metal bench was cold. The air smelled of disinfectant and rust. For the first time, there were no cameras, no jurors, no eyes to feed on. He tried to steady his breathing, but the rhythm faltered. Every sound, the buzz of the light, the faint drip from a pipe, felt magnified, like the walls were listening. He pressed his palms against his knees and stared at the floor. In his mind, he replayed his mother's words, the tremor in her voice as she said she wouldn't protect him anymore. For a moment he wanted to laugh, to shove the feeling away with arrogance like he always had, but the laughter never came. It sat in his chest, heavy and useless. Hours later, 2 officers arrived to transfer him. Their voices were flat, procedural. They cuffed his wrists, read him the terms, and marched him through a tunnel that smelled of damp concrete and old fear. At the end waited a van, white, windowless, humming with the sound of the engine. He climbed in. The door slammed, the locks clanked, and the world outside disappeared. Through the narrow grate in the back, Ethan could see slivers of the city passing by, the courthouse steps now empty, the grey drizzle slicking the sidewalks, the crowd dispersing into anonymity. Somewhere in that blur was his mother walking alone, head down, shoulders hunched against the rain. He looked away quickly, as if the sight burned. The drive felt endless. Each turn, each stoplight, a reminder that the distance between who he was and where he was going could no longer be undone. When the van finally pulled through the gates of Franklin County Detention Center, the sound of the bars sliding open echoed like a mechanical growl. The officers led him out, the cuffs biting against his skin. Inside, the air was thicker, warmer, heavy with sweat and bleach. The intake officer didn't look at him twice. Paperwork, fingerprints, mugshot. The flash went off. One brief burst of light, and then darkness again. He was given a number, a jumpsuit, and a cell key card that wasn't his to use. His name no longer mattered. The number did. They walked him down the corridor, past rows of cells where faces pressed against narrow windows to watch the new arrival. "Fresh meat," someone muttered. Laughter followed, low and cruel. Ethan kept his eyes forward. The bravado he had once worn like armor didn't fit here. These men weren't impressed by defiance. They'd all tried it, and the walls had swallowed it whole. When the guard finally stopped, he tapped the metal bars. "This is you." The cell was small, square, painted a dull shade of grey that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A single bed, a toilet, a metal shelf that passed for a desk. The air smelled faintly of mildew. Ethan stepped inside, the door sliding shut behind him with a sound that seemed to cut through the marrow of his bones. He sat down on the bunk and stared at the wall opposite him. There was a tiny scratch in the paint, a single crooked line running diagonally. He reached out, traced it with his finger, then stopped. He wasn't sure how long he sat there before the noise of the prison began to seep in. The clang of distant doors, the murmur of voices, the faint rhythm of footsteps overhead. The sound wasn't constant. It came in waves, like the building itself was breathing. Somewhere down the hall, an inmate laughed. Another shouted something incoherent. Then silence again. That first night, Ethan didn't sleep. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, counting the flickers in the fluorescent light outside his door. Every few minutes, a guard's shadow would pass by, a reminder that freedom was not just gone, but replaced by surveillance. He tried to think of the courtroom, of the cameras, of the smug confidence that had once made him feel alive. But when he pictured it now, all he saw was his mother's face, the look of recognition and defeat. That expression haunted him more than the sentence itself. In the days that followed, the rhythm of confinement began to take shape. Wake up at 5. Breakfast at 6. Head count. Yard time, silence, repeat. The sameness was suffocating. The meals tasted of cardboard. The conversations were brief and meaningless. Yet it was the silence between those moments that pressed hardest against his skull. He noticed how the older inmates moved. Slow, deliberate, eyes always scanning. He heard their whispers, their coded language, their laughter that never reached their eyes. And he realized something terrifying. In this place, mockery meant nothing. Violence did. The first time someone tested him, it happened in the cafeteria. A tray bumped his shoulder deliberately hard. Ethan turned, met the stare of a tall man covered in tattoos, a grin spreading across his face.
"You the kid from the news?"
The man asked. Ethan hesitated. "Yeah," the man chuckled.
"Thought so."
"You don't look so tough without the cameras." Laughter rippled from the nearby tables. Ethan didn't respond. He picked up his tray and walked away. The man called after him, "Welcome to the real world, superstar." He kept walking. He didn't see the guard watching from the corner, but the man did. The taunt stopped there. For now, that night, Ethan sat in his cell listening to the hum of the vents, the distant clang of gates. His heart wouldn't slow down. He thought about that smirk he'd worn in court, how it had felt to believe no one could touch him. That feeling was gone now, replaced by something colder, smaller, real. Days blurred into each other. There was no sunrise in prison, just the flicker of artificial light at the same hour every morning, the clang of doors, the smell of powdered eggs and disinfectant. Ethan began to lose sense of time. Each minute felt stretched thin, then suddenly swallowed whole. The guards didn't speak much. The inmates spoke too much. Their voices echoed down the corridors, mixing with the metallic sounds of keys and chains. Sometimes a fight would break out, quick, brutal, and over before anyone could react. The guards didn't rush. They'd seen it all before. Blood was as common as dust here. Ethan tried to stay invisible. He kept to his cell, read whatever he could find. Old magazines, torn paperbacks with missing covers. He scribbled on scraps of paper, half-formed thoughts that made sense only to him. At first it was arrogance again. "They can't break me." But later the words began to shift. Why did she do it? Why did she look at me that way? His mother's face refused to leave him. Every night, as the lights dimmed and the prison quieted, he saw her standing there in that courtroom, her voice trembling but clear. "I won't protect you anymore." The words replayed in his head like a recording. Sometimes he whispered them aloud, testing how they sounded in the dark. Outside those walls, the world had already moved on. News coverage dwindled. The story that had once dominated every headline became just another file in the archives. There were newer tragedies now, fresher faces for the cameras to dissect. For a few weeks, a documentary crew requested interviews, but the warden declined. "The kid's done enough damage," he said. Inside, however, the legend of the smirking killer lived on. New arrivals recognized him. Some wanted to talk. Others wanted to test him. A few admired him in the twisted hierarchy that prison created. They whispered that he was fearless, that he'd killed for respect. Ethan never corrected them. It was easier to let the myth survive than to reveal the hollow underneath. But myths don't last long in a place built to strip you bare. It started with the dreams. At first, they were fragments, a voice calling his name, a classroom door closing, the sound of chalk against a board. Then faces, David Campbell's, pale and still, his mother's fading into the dark. He would wake gasping, the thin mattress slick with sweat, the ceiling spinning above him. One night he jolted awake to the sound of whispering from the next cell. Two men were talking about him. "Kid's losing it," one said. "Good, about time." Laughter followed, harsh, metallic. Ethan pressed his palms over his ears, but it didn't help. The laughter was inside him now. Weeks passed. He began to count the scratches on the wall, marking them with a piece of broken plastic from his tray. He wasn't sure why. There was no meaning to the numbers, no end in sight. But the motion kept him from thinking too much. The guards noticed the change. They didn't say anything, but they watched him closer. The psychologist assigned to his block tried to meet with him once a week. "Do you think about what you did?" she asked one day, her voice careful, neutral. He stared at her for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "Why not?" "Because thinking doesn't change it. Then what does?" He didn't answer. After that, she wrote something in her notes and didn't ask again. Months slipped by. The seasons changed outside, though Ethan saw them only through the small window above his bed, a square of light that shifted from grey to black and back again. Sometimes, When the air was still, he could hear the faint sounds of life beyond the walls. Car horns, rain on pavement, maybe even laughter from somewhere distant. It was almost worse than silence. It reminded him that the world was still spinning without him, that time didn't care who he had been or what he had done. One afternoon, he received a letter. The handwriting was familiar, though shaky. His mother. He hesitated before opening it, his hands trembling slightly. Inside were only a few lines. I visit the cemetery every Sunday. There are flowers there for him. I don't know what I'm supposed to say to you anymore. I still hope you find something. Not forgiveness, maybe not even peace, just something that isn't emptiness. He read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it under his pillow. That night he didn't dream. In the weeks after that, something in him began to slow. He still went through the motions, meals, head counts, yard time, but there was no spark of rebellion left. When other inmates jeered, he didn't react. When a guard shoved him, he just stepped aside. The arrogance that once defined him had drained away completely, leaving behind a quiet, almost eerie calm. But beneath that calm was a growing fracture, a silence that didn't feel like control anymore. It felt like collapse. It was in the silence after lights out that the cracks began to widen. Ethan lay awake, staring at the faint shadows moving across the ceiling. Every sound in the block carried, the soft clank of metal bunks, someone coughing, the buzz of the overhead lights. He counted them without meaning to, anything to keep from thinking. But thoughts always found their way in, like water through stone. He started talking to himself, not out loud at first, just inside his head, running through old arguments, rewriting conversations from the trial. In these private rehearsals, he was always in control, always clever enough to turn every question back on the world that had condemned him. But gradually, his own voice began to turn on him. What are you defending? What do you have left? One night, he caught his reflection in the narrow strip of polished metal that passed for a mirror. The face that looked back was thinner now, paler, the eyes sunken. There was no trace of the smirk that had once infuriated an entire courtroom, just a boy who suddenly looked very small. He leaned closer, whispering to his reflection, "You won, didn't you?" The reflection didn't answer. It was then that the memory came, not a flash, but a flood. The night of the murder, the sound of glass giving way under his hand, the creak of the floorboards, the startled voice calling out, "Who's there?" He remembered the panic, the rush of it, the way his heart had hammered in his chest. But what came next was harder to bear, the way his mind had gone silent, utterly detached, as though someone else had taken over. He remembered David Campbell's eyes, not angry, not afraid, just bewildered, like a man seeing a storm he never thought would reach him. And he remembered what came after, the quiet, the weight of the body, the terrible stillness. He hadn't thought of it since that night. Now it played in his head on a loop that refused to end. He pressed his hands to his temples until his nails bit into skin, trying to force it away. But memory has no mercy. It seeps through everything. Days later, he was called to meet with the prison chaplain. "I didn't ask to see you," Ethan muttered as he sat down. "I know," the chaplain said gently. "Sometimes I come anyway. I don't believe in God. That's fine. He still believes in you." Ethan almost laughed. He shouldn't. The chaplain didn't argue. He just sat there, his hands folded on the table, waiting. The silence stretched until Ethan finally asked, "Why are you here?" "Because silence can drown a person faster than guilt can," the man said. "And you look like someone who's been drowning for a long time." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The words echoed in him, drowning. He dreamed again, only this time it wasn't the crime he saw. It was the face of his mother at the trial, her voice trembling as she broke the last tie between them. He woke up gasping, the sheets tangled around him like ropes. He sat there in the dark for a long time, listening to his own breathing. For the first time, it sounded like fear. The next morning, he didn't go to the yard. He stayed in his cell, staring at the small square of light from the window. Dust drifted through it, glittering in the air. He thought about how something could look beautiful, even in a place built entirely from despair. Weeks passed. His behavior changed enough that the guards noticed. He followed orders, didn't speak unless spoken to. When he passed the chaplain in the corridor, he nodded. It wasn't repentance, not yet, but something had begun to shift inside him, something uncertain and fragile. Then one day, during mail call, another letter came. He recognized the handwriting again, his mother's, but this one was shorter. "They're moving me to another state. I don't know if I'll be able to visit for a while. I still think about who you were before all this. I hope, wherever you are now, you think about him too." He folded the paper carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. He sat there, tracing the crease with his thumb, then whispered to no one, "I do." In the months that followed, the name Ethan Walker began to fade from public memory entirely. The world, as it always does, found new stories to consume. But inside those walls, he became something else. Not the legend of arrogance he once tried to project, but a ghost of his own making. Sometimes, the guards would see him standing by the window, motionless, eyes fixed on something far beyond the fences. Maybe he was thinking of freedom. Maybe he was thinking of the man he'd killed. Maybe both. The other inmates stopped mocking him. There was nothing left in him to provoke. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't proud either. Just hollow. And within that hollowness, a faint, painful awareness that this was what truth felt like. Late one night, when the block was quiet, a guard walking past heard him whisper something to the darkness. He couldn't make out the words, only the tone, low, breaking, almost human, and for the first time since his arrest, Ethan Walker cried. The years that followed moved like ghosts through the town that had once burned with anger and grief. The story of Ethan Walker faded from headlines, but not from memory. There were reminders everywhere. The empty house on Willow Creek Lane that no one wanted to buy. The old school where students still whispered about that boy. And the cemetery where one grave was always freshly tended, week after week, by the same quiet woman who never spoke to anyone. That woman was Margaret Walker, Ethan's mother. She had sold the family home after the trial. Too many echoes, too many rooms that still smelled like her son's cologne. Too many nights when she'd wake expecting to hear his door creak open. She moved into a small apartment near the edge of town, a place with thin walls and too much silence. The neighbors didn't ask questions. She didn't offer answers. Every Sunday she took the same bus to the same cemetery. She never stayed long. She would kneel by David Campbell's grave, clean the stone, replace the flowers. Sometimes she brought white lilies, sometimes daisies. She never chose roses. She said once that they felt too proud, too loud for the kind of pain that had rooted itself in her life. At first, people resented her presence. Some whispered when she walked past, some crossed the street. But over time, even the whispers faded. She had become a ghost among the living, a woman carrying a punishment deeper than any prison could offer. Inside her apartment, she kept one box locked away in the bottom of her closet. Inside were pieces of the past she couldn't bear to throw away. Ethan's school photos, a birthday card he'd made her when he was 9, a newspaper clipping from the trial. She never opened it, but knowing it was there somehow kept her anchored. Sometimes she wondered if she had done the right thing that day in court, standing up and saying what no mother should ever have to say. She had replayed the moment countless times, the way her voice cracked, the silence that followed, Ethan's stunned expression. It had been the truth, that much she knew, but the truth doesn't always bring peace. It just brings finality. Letters from him came sporadically. The handwriting changed over the years. Sharp at first, defiant, then slower, heavier. His words were never elaborate. "I'm fine. They moved me to a new block. I had a dream about Dad." Once, a letter contained only a single sentence. "I think I understand now." She didn't know what he meant, but she cried when she read it. Outside her small apartment, life continued as if nothing had ever happened. The world had grown faster, louder, less forgiving. But in quiet corners of that town, memories still clung like shadows. There were parents who still locked their doors twice at night, teachers who still hesitated when a student raised his voice, and children who still whispered the name Ethan Walker as if it were a ghost story. David Campbell's parents had moved away 2 years after the trial. The weight of the town's pity was too much. They settled in another state near the ocean where no one recognized them. Yet even there, they could not outrun the memory of their son. His mother often said she still heard his laughter in the sound of the waves. His father stopped speaking about it altogether. But grief has a strange way of intertwining lives. One winter afternoon, Margaret received a letter with no return address. Inside was a short note written in elegant cursive. "I don't know if forgiveness is possible, but I know that hate keeps us both in the same cage. I'm leaving flowers tomorrow. You should too." It was signed only. MC Margaret didn't have to guess who it was. The next day she went to the cemetery, unsure what to expect. The wind was sharp, the sky colorless. When she arrived, there was another woman already there, tall, thin, her hair streaked with grey. She turned when she heard footsteps. For a moment neither spoke. Then Margaret whispered, "Mrs. Campbell." The woman nodded. Her eyes were red but steady. "I wasn't sure you'd come. I didn't know if I should." They stood there side by side, looking down at the grave. The flowers Margaret had brought, white lilies, trembled in the wind. Mrs. Campbell placed her own bouquet next to them. For a long time there were no words, only the sound of leaves moving across the ground. Then Mrs. Campbell said, "I used to hate you. I thought if I hated you enough it would hurt less." Margaret swallowed. "And did it?" "No," the woman said quietly. "It just kept him dead twice over." The two women stood there until the cold began to bite through their coats. When they finally turned to leave, Mrs. Campbell said softly, "You did the right thing that day. No mother should have to, but you did." Margaret didn't answer, but something in her chest loosened. Not forgiveness, not peace, but a small release from the weight she'd carried for years. That night, back in her apartment, she wrote to Ethan for the first time in months. "I saw Mrs. Campbell today. We didn't talk much, but we didn't need to. I think you should know that not everything is lost. Not yet." When Ethan received that letter weeks later, he read it again and again. For days, he kept it folded in his pocket as if afraid it might disappear. He didn't write back immediately. He didn't know how. But something inside him began to shift again, the faint stirring of a conscience that had long been buried under layers of pride and denial. He started attending the chaplain's group sessions, sitting silently in the back at first, listening to others talk about guilt and loss. Eventually he spoke. His voice trembled at first, but then steadied. "I used to think I wasn't capable of regret," he said one day. "Now I know regret isn't something you feel. It's something that eats you slowly from the inside out." The chaplain nodded, saying nothing. Some truths didn't need commentary. Back in her small apartment, Margaret sat by the window at night, staring out at the quiet street. Sometimes she imagined the sound of her son's laughter from long ago, echoing faintly through the years. Sometimes she imagined him as he was now, older, changed, perhaps finally understanding the enormity of what he had done. She didn't pray for his freedom anymore. She prayed for something simpler, that when he closed his eyes at night, he could still find a piece of himself worth saving. The letter announcing the transfer hearing arrived in early spring. By then, Ethan had spent nearly 8 years behind bars. The seasons had cycled through the narrow window in his cell, grey to gold to grey again, until they no longer seemed to mean anything. But that letter, stamped and official, pierced through the fog of routine like a shard of glass. The hearing wasn't about freedom, not really. It was a procedural review, a chance for the board to decide whether he should remain in the same facility or be moved to one with fewer restrictions. A small step, but to some a symbol. To Ethan, it felt like a test he didn't know how to study for. When the guards handed him the notice, he stared at it for a long time. His hands didn't shake, but something inside him did. For years, he had lived in the monotony of consequence, where every day was identical and safe in its predictability. The hearing threatened to stir something that had long gone dormant. Hope. He wasn't sure he wanted it. Hope, he'd learned, could be cruel. News of the hearing reached his mother before he could write to her. Margaret received the call from a victim's liaison, polite and measured, explaining the process, offering her the chance to attend and make a statement if she wished. She thanked them quietly, hung up, and sat for a long while staring at the wall. The idea of seeing her son again filled her with a complicated ache. Fear, love, guilt, and something nameless that lay between them. She hadn't seen him in person since the day the verdict was read. Years of distance had preserved that final image of him, the sneer fading from his face, the boy beneath the arrogance exposed. She didn't know if she was ready to replace that image with whatever time had turned him into. For 3 nights, she didn't sleep. Then on the 4th, she ironed her old grey dress, the same one she'd worn to court all those years ago, and said aloud to the empty room, "He deserves to know I came." The day of the hearing dawned pale and cold. The prison's administrative building buzzed with a subdued tension. The panel sat in a semicircle, 3 officials, a counsellor, and a victim's representative. A few rows behind, Margaret sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. When they brought Ethan in, she barely recognized him. The boy, who had once strutted into the courtroom with a smirk, was gone. In his place was a man with hollowed cheeks, steady eyes, and a kind of quiet that wasn't defiance anymore. It was exhaustion, or perhaps acceptance. He didn't look up at first, but when he did, his gaze found her instantly. Their eyes met for the first time in nearly a decade. She expected a flicker of resentment or shame or even anger. But what she saw instead was something much simpler, a kind of wordless acknowledgement, the faintest nod that said, "I know." The hearing began. The board reviewed his record, disciplinary reports, psychological evaluations, work assignments. The counselor noted improvements, cited participation in group therapy and consistent good behavior. The warden confirmed it. Ethan listened in silence, his hands clasped together on the table, his gaze fixed straight ahead. When it was his turn to speak, he hesitated. His throat felt dry, the words heavy before they even formed. "I don't have a defense," he began softly. "What I did took away a life, and I can't make sense of it even now. I don't want forgiveness, because I don't think I deserve it. But I've learned that punishment isn't about what happens to you. It's about what you have to live with. Every day I wake up and remember. That's my sentence." There was no tremor in his voice, just a calm, steady grief that came from living too long with silence. When they asked if he had anything else to say, he turned slightly toward his mother. His eyes were tired but clear. "I used to think I was untouchable," he said. "Now I know I was just unreachable. She tried to reach me and I didn't let her. I don't know if she still believes in me, but I believe her voice that day in court saved me, even if it didn't look like it." Margaret's breath caught in her chest. For the first time, she saw her son not as the monster the world had painted, nor the child she had lost, but as a man finally standing in the shadow of what he had done, and no longer trying to escape it. When it was her turn to speak, she rose slowly. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "I'm here as a mother," she said, "but I'm also here as someone who has learned that love doesn't end, even when it breaks. My son did something terrible. I can't undo it. Neither can he. But I have seen what hate does. It eats what's left of you. I believe he's faced himself now, truly, and that's something no one else can do for him." The room was silent. Even the guards seemed to stand a little stiller. The board deliberated for nearly half an hour. When they returned, their decision was measured but clear. Ethan would be transferred to a lower security facility. Not freedom, but a small step toward it. As the guards prepared to escort him out, he turned once more to his mother. There were no words exchanged, just a look, a brief, fragile connection that said everything both had been too afraid to say for years. Later, outside the gates, Margaret stood for a while, watching the grey clouds gather. She felt neither joy nor relief, only a quiet sense of something unfinished, finally beginning to close. Weeks later, Ethan arrived at the new facility. It was quieter, less severe. The walls were still high, but there was a garden, small and neglected at the far end of the yard. He volunteered to work there. Every morning, he tended the soil, planting small rows of flowers that rarely bloomed, but still reached for the sun. It became his ritual, something to hold on to. The chaplain sometimes joined him, talking softly about redemption, but Ethan rarely answered. He didn't believe in redemption as something given. For him, it had to be built, one act at a time, even if no one saw it. One afternoon, he found an envelope waiting for him on his bunk. The handwriting was familiar again, but different, steadier, stronger. His mother had written, "I'm proud of you for staying, for not giving up. I can't change what's behind us, but maybe we can both learn to live with it, without it destroying us. That's enough for me." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, but carried warmth all the same. He folded the letter and placed it in his pocket before heading to the garden. The air smelled faintly of rain. That night, as the lights went out, Ethan lay awake and thought of his mother's words. For years, he had imagined that punishment was something imposed on you. Now he realized it was something you either learned from or drowned beneath. He didn't know what waited beyond the walls. He didn't even know if he'd ever walk free. But for the first time in years, he felt something like balance, fragile, flickering, but real. The years rolled on, quiet and unremarkable, like a tide that never quite reached the shore. The world outside changed in ways Ethan could only imagine. Faces aged, towns grew, names he once knew faded into dust. Inside the low walls of the rehabilitation center, time moved differently, slow, deliberate, like a clock with a fading heartbeat. He worked in the garden every morning. The soil had become his confessional. Each seed he pressed into the earth was a kind of prayer, not for forgiveness, not even for peace, but for understanding. He had long given up on being the person he once was. What remained of him now was quieter, smaller, but somehow truer. The other inmates treated him differently. Some sought his advice, others just sat beside him in silence. In a place full of anger and noise, his calm had become its own kind of language. The chaplain once told him, "When you stop trying to be saved, you begin to heal." Ethan hadn't understood it then. Now he did. He still wrote to his mother, though less often. The letters had become simpler over the years. Just fragments of thoughts, sketches of his days, mentions of the garden, or a book he'd read. She always wrote back. Her handwriting grew shakier with each envelope, but her words never lost their gentleness. Then, one spring morning, a letter came that wasn't from her. It was from a family friend, an old neighbor who had helped Margaret with errands. The words were short, careful, but heavy enough to hollow out his chest. "Your mother passed peacefully in her sleep last night. She asked that you be told she loved you, and that she forgave you long ago." Ethan read it once, then again. The words blurred. He sat on the edge of his bunk, the paper trembling in his hands, and for a long time he couldn't breathe. The cell around him felt smaller than ever, its walls closing in, the air heavy. When the guard came to check on him later, he found Ethan sitting perfectly still, staring at the floor. The letter was folded neatly beside him. He didn't cry, not then. The grief had never been loud for him. It was quiet, relentless, like a slow current pulling him under. The next morning, he went to the garden early. The ground was wet from rain, the air thick with the smell of earth. He knelt, pressing his fingers into the mud, and whispered a few words that no one heard. Then he planted something new, a single white lily. It was the flower his mother had always brought to David Campbell's grave. The petals trembled in the wind, fragile but unbroken. For weeks after, he worked in silence. The other inmates left him alone. Even the guards, hardened and distant, gave him space. The chaplain visited, bringing with him a small Bible that had belonged to Margaret. Inside the cover, she had written in careful script, "You were born with light. You just have to stop hiding from it." He traced the letters with his thumb until the ink smudged faintly. Then he closed the book and held it against his chest. Months passed. The garden began to bloom again, small bursts of color breaking through the soil. Each morning, Ethan tended to them like something sacred. It was his ritual, his quiet way of keeping her alive. One day, the warden came to him during roll call. "You've got a visitor," he said. Ethan frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he entered the visitation room, there was a woman waiting for him, a little older than he remembered, her hair streaked with silver, her eyes familiar. It took him a moment to place her. "Mrs. Campbell," he said softly. She nodded. "I wasn't sure you'd remember." "I remember," he said. They sat across from each other in silence for a while. Finally, she said, "I heard about your mother. I wanted to tell you I was sorry." He blinked, surprised. "You're sorry?" She nodded again. "We've both lost someone we loved to what you did. But I think your mother spent the rest of her life trying to make sure that what happened didn't destroy you. I think she succeeded." He looked down at his hands, rough and stained with dirt. "I don't know if that's true." "She believed it was," Mrs. Campbell said quietly. "And I think maybe that's enough." They talked for a few minutes more, about small things, the garden, the town, how quiet everything had become. When she stood to leave, she paused and said, "I used to hate you. I thought I'd never stop. But I've learned that hate is just another kind of cage. I don't want to live in one anymore." After she left, Ethan sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chair. For the first time in years, he felt something ease inside him. Not release, not absolution, but a fragile human understanding that maybe this was what healing really looked like. Two broken lives no longer chained to the same moment. That night, he wrote his final letter. Not to anyone in particular, but to the memory of his mother. "You told me once that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering without letting it destroy you. I think I finally understand that. I'm not who I was. Maybe I never will be again, but I'm still here. And I'm still trying." He folded the letter and placed it inside the Bible she had left him. Then he turned off the small lamp by his bunk and lay in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the night. Outside, the garden waited under the moonlight. The lily he'd planted stood tall, its petals open toward the sky. The air was cool and still, and for a moment, the silence didn't feel like punishment anymore. It felt like peace. Years later, when the facility finally closed and the grounds were cleared, the garden was the only thing left untouched. Amid the overgrown weeds, one white lily still bloomed every spring, stubborn and bright against the grey earth. No one who passed by knew its story, but those who saw it sometimes paused, sensing something sacred in its quiet defiance, a single living thing born from guilt, nurtured by grief and kept alive by the faintest echo of forgiveness. And somewhere, in the soft wind that moved through the garden, there was the lingering whisper of a mother's voice. "You were born with light. You just had to stop hiding from it."